I'll introduce Michael Liquori. Mike works with a group called Sound Watershed. He's a geomorphologist. He has, for the past couple of years, worked with the Board of Forestry VTAC committee to develop some alternatives for managing riparian vegetation in the context of timber harvest plans. With that, Mike, I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the site-specific riparian management guidelines that have been developed under Section V of the new or anatomous salmonid protection rules that were promulgated by the Board of Forestry a few months ago, actually a couple of years ago now. The guidance document for this came out in January. I think can be found at the CAL FIRE VTAC website. That's VTAC. And I'll go over some of that in a little bit more detail here in a bit. A lot of the motivation for the new rules came about as a response to the listing of anatomous salmonids that occurred, it's been about 10 plus years now. There are populations all along the north coast and central coast and even the south coast with steelhead. Although the focus for the anatomous salmonid protection rules is primarily the operational areas of California, being the central and north coast and the inland foothills of the Sierras. The motivation for the anatomous rules came about when looking at the way that riparian buffers have kind of evolved over the last number of years. We've had in the late 1970s, the state of California kind of started leading the nation in putting into place riparian buffers. By about the mid-90s, most states in the western United States and Alaska had riparian buffers on fish-bearing streams, and we're starting to even extend some of them into non-fish-bearing streams. Most of those buffer strategies were based on what we call uniform continuous buffers. In other words, the buffer widths were usually not very different from one site to the next. The structure was not very different from one site to the next, and the thinking was if you just left it alone, it would naturally recover. What we're finding is that that's not necessarily the case. The technical basis for the anatomous salmonid protection rules was pulled together through a process that started in about 2007 and involved a technical advisory committee, the members of which I'll show here in a minute, who put out a contract for a riparian literature review. And the group of us that got together to put the literature review together is listed on this slide. We looked at quite a bit of literature. It's probably about almost 3 feet of bookshelf space stored in binders that are overflowing. And these were based on in 5 different areas, which we'll go into in a bit. The members of the VTAC included a lot of folks from various agencies throughout the state, as well as a few consultants and other members of the timber community. The dialogue that went on with the TAC was pretty intensive. There was a whole number of key questions, something like 50-some key questions, I think, that we ended up working through with all the literature that we reviewed. The outcome of that was the recognition that rather than focusing on these uniform continuous buffer strategies, that we might want to start looking at strategies that try to focus on the different site aspects. And for a while we were calling it site-specific. Some of us are calling it explicit because it's actually more, it's not just a site-specific thing, it's actually a function of time, it's a function of space, it's a function of a whole bunch of variables. But the idea was that no longer would we be focusing on creating continuous buffers uniformly through the system, but we would focus our buffer strategies on providing function. These new ideas were accepted by the Board of Forestry and put into place in 2009 under the Anadromous Unlanded Protection Rules. In that, they kind of put two strategies for meeting riparian buffers. One is kind of an expansion of the previous uniform continuous buffer strategy that tried to focus a little bit more on functions, but came up with a relatively prescriptive way of applying riparian strategies. But what was also employed in this particular rule set was in section V of the rules, 916.v, allows for site-specific riparian design. And we spent much of the last couple of years developing guidance for what that would actually look like, and I'll go over some of that today. The basis of this was the fact that rules lack spatially relevant guidance for where factors are limiting, and thus all factors tend to be limiting everywhere, at least under the previous buffer strategies. The new strategies try to focus the specific functions based on what the site needs are. So we're no longer assuming that everything is important everywhere. We now have the ability to be a little bit more flexible. So if you have a site that is more temperature sensitive, maybe temperature is the driving factor. If you have a site that's maybe more wood limited, maybe wood is the driving factor. And we've got some strategies for how to make those decisions that I'll show you in a minute. The Section V rules achieve riparian goals through these spatially explicit, context-specific objectives, and they're established by actual site conditions, not rule assumptions. So that's kind of the basis there. The VTAC guidance document, I apologize, this side was supposed to have the website on it, website address on it, but I apparently forgot to get that in there. But the website can be found, as I said, on the CAL FIRE website. If you go to the CAL FIRE VTAC page, and it's on the right-hand side down towards the bottom of the page. The guidance document was put together by a number of folks. I chaired the committee, but we also had a number of other representatives, again, drawing from a broad cross-section of industry and agency representatives, and a pretty extensive component of CAL FIRE representatives, who I don't have on the slide here as well. The VTAC objectives were to establish principles, guidelines, and procedures, to broaden incentives, something we probably didn't make as much progress on as I think we would have hoped, and to establish the permitting efficiencies and reduce regulatory uncertainty. And we think we had enough of the people at the table to consider the various different regulatory issues that were going to come up as we deal with different agencies that need to weigh in on THPs. So we think we've worked out a lot of those kind of issues. Before we developed the guidance document, we conducted an extensive stakeholder survey. Involved a website design where we had a little video introduction to the issues, gave people an opportunity to weigh in. The survey involved a number of key questions that tried to ascertain people's general feelings about the way riparian management was handled. We sent it to a pretty broad distribution of email lists, but only got responses back from about 123 people. I think there was several thousand in the email lists that we sent out. About a third of them were managers and landowners. About a third of them were agency staff, and then the rest were different versions of consultants, public and advocacy groups. What we discovered was that there was a lot of interest in this site-specific approach to riparian management, and that the key constraint that people felt needed to be included in the guidance document was that it needed to be technically justified. And so we spent quite a bit of effort in the guidance document. That's why it took us nearly 3 years to pull the document together, because we put a pretty extensive effort into making sure that it was technically justified. Um, the survey messages suggested that there was widespread agreement that a site-based approach can be used where justified, that we needed increased levels of certainty for extensive use of the Section V. In other words, people felt like they wanted to have some pilot projects. They wanted to have some certainty that if they were to engage in the process, that it wasn't going to cost a lot of money and be rejected at the end. So let's go into the framework for how riparian design is supposed to work. What we recognize is that there's a relative importance of riparian functions varies across the landscape. We spent some time talking about this last week. And that the transport of riparian inputs usually affect conditions downstream as well, and conditions can change up and downstream. We also know that there are a range of different functional responses that occur from the four primary functions of wood, temperature regulation, sediment regulation, and nutrient cycling that respond to different kind of conditions in the watershed. We focus primarily on a few factors here: wood recruitment and how wood gets recruited to the stream through bank erosion processes, natural mortality processes. We focus on the nutrient dynamics and biotic integrity of the system, which is kind of a new kind of burgeoning science that's evolving. Ken Cummins will talk about that at length in a couple weeks. We want to address the response of fire and the issues that fire brings in riparian areas, especially in the Sierra Range and other places where fire is a dominant ecosystem processes. We want to focus on sediment delivery and sediment regulation to protect water quality, on wood recruitment that affects fish habitat, and on the regulation of temperature in the system. So, summarize our riparian functions for biotic and nutrient categories. We're focused on food supply and nutrient cycling. With heat, we're focused on the thermal controls on water temperature, things like shade, but also to some extent other factors that may influence the channel where you are in the system, whether you're north aspect, south aspect, things like that. To some extent microclimate, although our literature review suggested that microclimate was not important for the aquatic communities, it still may be important for some semi-aquatic communities like amphibians and maybe other terrestrial species as well. For water, we're concerned about hydromodification, although in the riparian zones we find that there's just not enough canopy interception in the riparian zones to affect hydromodification if you just look at the buffer alone. So that kind of dropped out of our approach. With wood, we're focused primarily on the functions of stream bed modification, how wood influences the channel morphology to create pools, spawning gravels, and to provide cover for fish. And with sediment, we're focused primarily on addressing surface runoff, stream-adjacent landsliding to some extent, mostly in the way of buffering the stream-adjacent landslide so that as the landslide, or where landslides do occur, that they do have a component of wood that's delivered to the stream, and bank and channel stabilization overall. So this is an example of some of the wood placement techniques that have been used. This is a slide from Jackson Demonstration State Forest, and I think there's a talk that later in this seminar series it'll talk a little bit more about the methodologies for doing these kinds of things. But there's other approaches aside from direct placement, things that you can do within the riparian community to affect riparian or to affect wood delivery. And this slide shows the difference between different thinning treatments. And one of the take-home messages here is as you thin, you can increase the diameter of tree sizes. So there's a way to use silvicultural tools in the riparian zone to affect not only the rates of mortality, but also the size of recruited wood that might deliver to the stream system. And there's some ways that you can play around with that to affect wood recruitment potential in the mid to long term. With biotic and diversity and nutrients, one of the things that we've recognized from a number of literature sources was that there are a number of nitrogen-fixing deciduous trees, primarily alder, that when distributed at key locations within the stream network can dramatically increase fish productivity, primarily through the mechanism of introducing nitrogen to the system that just cranks up the whole engine of biological productivity, and that perhaps a sufficient number of riparian canopy gaps that support primary and aquatic macroinvertebrate production can increase the growth rates of fish communities and increase their survival rates at sea. And so there's some strategies that allow you to do that. There's strategies that look at fuel hazard reduction, primarily driven by some of the riparian-dominated fires that have occurred, Angora Creek probably being one of the biggest, but other creeks like the Moonlight Fire up in the Feather River watershed, where fire behavior dropped to the ground in areas where they had defensive treatments, but tended to walk or move around those defensive treatments by going through the riparian communities that hadn't been treated. So, ideas of extending those riparian breaks in the fire-dominated areas, and that may not necessarily mean complete canopy removal, but even thinning or just modifying the stand so that fire risk gets reduced. The guidance document focused on a number of things. We identified criteria for site suitability, what types of conditions would lead towards different types of treatments. We tried to focus on using a site-based objective, so defining your objectives to the site early on. Gave you some different treatment options through a couple of different mechanisms. We defined the data necessary to justify the proposed actions, what would have to be collected and included in the permitting processes. And we provide a procedure for how the administration of those rules would be employed. So let's go into the documents, and I apologize that last slide said draft, where these are now final. But the process is this. There are basically two types of Section V project types. There is the limited spatial extent, which is defined within the rules, and the rules are listed there. If there's a limited spatial extent, you can get concurrence from Department of Fish and Game, then that's the extent that you need to employ for getting the regulatory approvals. If you're dealing with a larger scale project, then there are three different methods that we recommend. There's a classification approach, which is based on watershed analysis methodologies that have been deployed in states like Washington and Oregon and Idaho. There are situational scenarios. These are a series of common conditions that we see out on the landscape that we think we can recommend specific treatments towards. And then finally, there's an analytical design process that allows a landowner who might have an extensive amount of information or data or a lot of science on a particular landscape for them to use that science to justify a treatment that's specific to their landscape. So there were a number of different objectives and suitability criteria that we established. We defined five different management strategies for each different function. So of the four functions, wood recruitment, nutrient dynamics, sediment regulation, and thermal regulation, we define a different management objective, and those objectives are either to protect, which means to minimize disturbance and allow natural recovery processes to dominate. It would be to maintain, which means that some treatment might be allowed, but the idea is you don't want to disturb the natural processes too much because you want to let those processes continue to function. In other words, the trend of those functions looks good moving into the future, and you want to continue to promote that trend. Improved conditions would be in places where the objectives are not being met and the functions are not being met, and the desire is to try to improve conditions over time by changing the trajectory of those riparian processes. Restore would be very similar, but perhaps a little bit more impacted or more degraded functional regime. And then generally available was a classification where we didn't feel like that particular variable or process, for example, wood recruitment, would be an important component at that particular site. And therefore, we're basically saying that you don't need to constrain the riparian design for that particular variable. And I'll give you some examples of this here in a minute. So one thing I wanted to stress was that the VTAC has well, let me back up. There's a pre-consultation guidance process that the VTAC guidelines describe. And what this pre-consultation guideline allows a landowner to do is meet with the regulators and the agencies in advance of the of going into the process of designing the treatment, to just kind of feel out the possibility of getting the approvals in advance. The idea is to kind of a quick and dirty way, get a sense for what the key issues are going to be, where the problems might lie, and what kinds of information will need to be compiled in order to get the project approved. This is a completely voluntary process, but we felt like it would be very beneficial for landowners to engage in this. To support it, we developed a very brief field form that's in the guidance document. I believe it starts on page 125. And it's, I think, a 7-page form. You just fill out the form and add a couple of maps and provide that to the regulator agencies before a field visit, or sometimes you can do a virtual field visit if you don't want to go out in the field in advance. And then just have a discussion about it. There's also a subsequent form that can be used to document the results of that meeting so that you can maintain a paper trail. But we stress that the process is that no agency decisions will be made at this pre-consultation guidance meeting. It's purely a kind of a heads-up type meeting. So once you've theoretically got the pre-consultation out of the way, then the approach is, one of the approaches might be a classification matrix approach. This is focused around rule matrix, where basically you're developing a riparian. You use the existing site conditions to make a riparian classification. You combine that with a geomorphic classification. That gets cranked into this rule matrix, and then what comes out of that are specific segment objectives. And I'll give you an example of how this works here. So the geomorphic classification is based on stream type and class. So for class 1, large streams, there's a type of geomorphic class that exists. These are based on the Montgomery and Buffington classification system. The process basically is all you need to do is identify your class, the size of the stream, and the stream type, and it will give you your functional priority ratings for wood, for temperature, for nutrients, and for erosion risks. We follow that up with a riparian classification system where the composition of the vegetation, whether it's dominated by conifer, hardwood, or mixed, the relative tree size, is it smaller than functional, larger than functional, or mixed? Functional size depends on the size of the stream, and we've got some tables and plots in the guidance document that help you make that decision. And then the relative stand density, and this gets into a little bit more of the silvicultural approach, kind of following Oliver and Larson's idea of stem exclusion and understory reinitiation. There's a period of time at which a stand is differentiating, where there's active mortality. That's kind of the prime recruitment time in the cycle of tree growth. Or there's other sites that are fully stocked, which means that the mortality hasn't begun yet, but we can anticipate in some period of time as growth continues in that stand, that mortality will turn on. Or if you're in an understock condition, which means that you may be a longer period out before you start getting more active recruitment. And that stand density basically gives you a sense of what the time scale of recruitment potential is. Once you make those classifications, there's this rule box where you plug in your riparian classification and your channel classification. So if you have a good site condition on riparian and a high functional priority for the channel classification, you would end up in a protect category for that particular variable. Okay, there's a, let me back up here. So you do this for each of these functions: wood, temperature, nutrient, and erosion, and that will give you a set of segment objectives. So for example, if we did that for a particular site, we might find that we would need to improve the wood conditions, that we might need to maintain temperature conditions, that we might be able to protect the nutrient dynamics, and that we need to improve erosion risk. So that might be the type of particular objectives that would be set up for one particular site. Now, the scale of sites are variable. The idea is that when we talk about a site, the site is not a project site. The site is a particular reach. So you're going to need to classify the reaches within the treatment area, and you may have to do this for 3, 4, 5, 6 different reaches, depending on how variable conditions are at your site. The other scenario, or the other approach that we can use is the situation scenarios, and I won't go into detail here on how to define these, but they're in the guidance document. I'm just going to run through basically the types of situations we have. One would be a low wood recruitment loading, or actually, excuse me, low wood loading in the channel. In other words, there's very little wood currently existing, and low riparian mortality. So there's no potential for new wood to come in and no wood in the system. And then we have a series of recommendations that you might employ in that type of situation, largely dominated by active wood placement. Another situation that we have is head cutting or incised channels, where the wood that may have been in the channel is no longer functional because the channel's got so much hydromodification upstream that the channel is actively down cutting. And we have some strategies for how to deal with that. We have strategies for what to deal, or how to deal with areas where there's just low overall wood recruitment potential in the recruitment area. Areas with high catastrophic wildfire risk, and some treatment concepts for how to deal with sediment reduction within riparian zones. And this is largely using a lot of the biotechnical stabilization strategies that are out there. And then some approaches for relatively closed canopy riparian corridors that lack nitrogen-fixing species and have low primary productivity. So these are those cases in the North Coast Range, for example, where you might have miles and miles and miles of conifer-dominated riparian zones with very little canopy gaps and very little nutrient dynamics. And these systems tend to be kind of nutrient deserts that don't provide enough food sources for fish productivity. So like I said earlier, we have different suitability criteria. We have different design factors to consider, treatment options, and also some cautionary hazards, things that you might do that might further cause problems. And each one of those situational scenarios touches on each of these 4 topic areas. And then finally, we have an analytical design process. I won't go into too much detail here. The basic idea is that we require that you use an expert and maybe a team of experts to deal with how to address these, that you're allowed to look at larger scale systems and actually encouraged to look at larger scale systems. So you're not just focusing on a particular harvest unit, but you might be doing a watershed or a sub-watershed scale approach. So you can leverage the resources against multiple units. And the idea is that the expert team will start with a riparian functional assessment, will identify what management objectives there are, develop specific riparian design, have a process for how that design will be tracked and implemented over time, especially for multiple sites. And then finally, that there must be some kind of effectiveness assessment or adaptive management loop to close that process. The guidance document also includes a number of document appendices, the specific rule language, a section on the pre-consultation guidelines, maps of the ASP rule areas, some information on the watershed context and how to scale up this approach to a watershed scale type approach, which we greatly encourage. Some information about how to do channel typing and some diagrams around that, and an example using the classification matrix pathway that was used for, I think, the Soquel demonstration state forest, an actual project site there. So the next steps, I'll talk really briefly. The VTAC is still informally operating, although we officially disbanded it as of last December. And the reason for that is that we were hoping at the beginning of the process to engage in some pilot projects. But we had a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Nobody wanted to engage in a pilot project until they had an understanding of what the guidance was going to look like. And so we ended up having to put the guidance document together first. We're hoping, though, that we can encourage some eager beavers to get out and engage in this process early on through a pilot process in which members of the VTAC process will continue to stay engaged. We'd like to watch informally as these pilots go through the process and see if we can tease out any areas where we might need to improve the guidance, maybe clarify some uncertainties or otherwise kind of, button up the process a little bit. And that slide doesn't need to be there. So one of the final things that I want to talk about briefly, and this is just to introduce kind of the one thing that we had trouble with the VTAC group, and that was the issue of incentives. One of the things that we recognize is that the riparian strategies that are deployed throughout most of the state of California put these riparian communities on a trajectory where recovery is going to take centuries. And that's because we're using buffer strategies. In a lot of the areas like the redwood domain, trees just don't die, so they don't recruit. And so we want to try to encourage that because we think, all evidence seems to show that these salmonid species don't have centuries, that they're likely to blink out here in the next decade or two or three. And we need to kind of encourage more active enhancement and restoration of these riparian communities if we hope to recover salmonid species. In order to do that, we need to create some incentives. And in order to create incentives, we need to look at some alternative revenue pathways beyond just extracting timber. And this largely is focused on some of the ecosystem service possibilities that may be out there. So one of the ideas that we've been bantering around is to create some kind of permitting process that would maybe be driven by a third-party organization or might be a collaborative public-private kind of partnership where multiple landowners with multiple different projects and multiple different agencies would engage in stewardship actions in the riparian community involving carbon sequestration, improvements to water quality, habitat improvements, maybe pollutant tracking and channel restoration, and package those stewardship actions up in ways that might be attractive to various ecosystem service markets like carbon sequestration, or if you're in the Tahoe Basin, for example, like the water quality trading program that's going on up there. So there are different market models that are out there. We'd like to explore how some of those services might be employed in the riparian communities and how we might scale those up so that we can find resources to improve and enhance these riparian areas. So with that, I'll thank you. Excuse me. I put my website up here, or my email address up here primarily because I want to make myself available as the chair of the VTAC for anybody who has any questions or anybody who wants to volunteer for pilot projects, or if there's other feedback in engaging in the VTAC process that you want to bring forward as we look at maybe possible revisions to the document down the road. So with that, I'll say thank you and pass it back to Richard.
Thanks, Mike. Hopefully I'm not echoing again. I've tried my best to get rid of my echoes. But that being said, if I am echoing, please bear with me. We could take some questions now. If someone would like to pose a question, just write it into the chat box, and we'll cut it into the screen so everybody can see it. I think, Mike, I understand there actually are a few pilot projects that are out there and been proposed. At least Pete Caparata indicated to me that there were a few that were being proposed. Have you heard anything about those?
Yeah, there are a few pilot projects. Some of them have, they kind of come on and off the radar, depending on what happens with the economic conditions, the regulatory commissions, the fire season. We had one project, I think, with Calpine last year that we were looking at, and they had to abandon that project because they had some fire issues that they had to divert resources towards last year. I think that site may be back on the agenda for this summer, possibly. There's been some projects, I know the Campbell Timberland Management out on the, somewhere I think out on 10 Mile has a 10 Mile River has a wood placement project that they're running through the VTAC pilot process. There's kind of a pseudo pilot of the third approach, the analytical approach, that's going on in collaboration with Green Diamond. They've put together a team that are, it's actually a research project in riparian function that's kind of a landscape scale treatment. They don't technically have to go through the VTAC process because they have a habitat conservation plan, but they volunteered to use this as a pilot anyway. So that process is going on. And then I think there's a couple others that are possibly on the radar.
Mike De La Salle, can you cut the questions in? I'm having a little trouble doing that. There's three questions. One is from Stefan. How fine are the distinctions between the management boxes, say between maintain and improve?
You know, that's one of the more qualitative aspects of this. It's not, there's no really hard, tight line between those by any means. They're mostly intended to provide kind of a flavor for what the treatment ought to be. Now, one of the things you may notice is we set objectives, but we didn't define how to meet those objectives. And that will be the process. That's where the real creativity comes in this process, is that each forester is going to have to take a look at their site in a very careful way, preferably in consultation with experts, and decide once they set those objectives, okay, now how are they going to meet those objectives? And there's lots of different tools that we talk about using. There's silvicultural tools if you're looking at wood recruitment. There are temperature models if you're looking at temperature. There's screening approaches that you can do. And I didn't have time to go into all that today, but I'm happy to do so. And if anybody has any questions specifically, feel free to drop me an email, and we can engage in a more focused discussion on your particular issue.
Eloise has got a question here about mitigation as a funding source. I guess I would have the same kind of question. A lot of the projects that we're talking about are actually funded, grant funded, at least on the coast, through the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program. But what about mitigations, like mitigation banking or such?
Yeah, exactly. We are very interested in developing some kind of mitigation bank approach. Sound Watershed actually submitted a proposal in collaboration with an economics firm out of Oakland here and some folks out of the Pacific Northwest. We submitted for a grant at the USDA Forest Service grant program about a year ago. Unfortunately, that grant funding program was cut by Congress, so even though we submitted the grant, it wasn't we weren't funded. But we think that mitigation banks are an opportunity. These different sequestration markets, like carbon sequestration, might be an opportunity, especially if you're dealing with things like fire or wetland communities adjacent to the riparian area. There's a lot of carbon can be stored in wetlands. So enhancing riparian wetlands can be one way of sequestering carbon. There's also different markets like up in the north, like in Tahoe. There's also some examples in the Northwest of these markets that are pollutant trading markets. And these are primarily around sediment or temperature, where like in the Tahoe Basin, the idea is you may not be able to reduce sediment production or productivity off of your land, but you could come up with some money to buy credits from another project that might be doing that. So there's lots of new and exciting developments in the ecosystem service markets. A lot of them are a little bit of a tease. They look and sound good in theory, but have been having trouble getting off the ground. And what we really feel like we need to make progress on that is some kind of feasibility project where we can start looking at how would you build a market, how those markets would be administered, where the funding sources would come from those markets, all that kind of stuff. And that's going to take probably some research and development over the next couple of years to employ.
There's two questions here. One from Joe. Would you consider a pilot project on public lands in Oregon? I do know, or I have heard at least, that there is some experimentation along these lines going on the ONC land in southern Oregon. And then Tina's got a question about public lands as an opportunity for a pilot project. I think it needs to be clear that the VTAC process pertains within the framework of the timber harvest process, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
It's not independent of the forest practice rules. It's embedded in the forest practice rules. So unless you've got an active timber harvest plan, it doesn't apply.
That's technically correct. However, the methodologies that we created under the VTAC guidance, I think, could apply anywhere.
So that's true. That's definitely true.
Yeah, and to that extent, I think having the experience in whether it's in Oregon or whether it's on public lands. I know the Forest Service, for example, in the Quincy Library Group area has been experimenting with some riparian improvement areas as well, primarily focused on cottonwood and some other functions in various places. So I think having pilots in those areas is helpful because any kind of information or any kind of feedback about how these systems work is useful. The methodologies that we developed, specifically when you start getting into some of the detail about the classification mechanisms that we use, a lot of that had been vetted through watershed analysis, but there's still, I think, some opportunity to refine some of those classifications a little bit. Some of them, because the watershed analyses methodology was developed in Washington State, there may be some nuances about how they apply in California. We don't think so, but I think those are the kinds of things that the pilot projects should help to flush out. So I would say, yeah, if we can engage with anybody anywhere, we'd be more than happy to do so.
Okay, well, I think that's probably all the questions we have now. Thanks again, Mike. And